Hi guys, it's Thorin. I am home working on some essays. I've got a couple of deadlines coming up for Llewellyn things, which is exciting. But as is characteristic, I'm waiting until the last moment possible to get that stuff done. So here I am. I went to Raleigh yesterday to see a show, and I spent a little bit of time in Raleigh, which is nice. My boyfriend lives in Raleigh, and I go to visit him, and I used to live there, so it's cool getting to kind of go to my old hangouts, particularly the metaphysical shops in the area. Although when I was there was just Dancing Moon. Now there's the Holy Rose, and there is another shop that opened up like last year in Durham called Everyday Magic, which isn't a metaphysical shop per se. It's more like a home decor, witchy aesthetic, something store. But anyway, they have rocks, and I like rocks, so that's really all it takes. But one of the things that I did right before I left was I swung by my favorite used bookstore in Raleigh, which is the Reader's Corner. And it was lucky because every now and then you go into a used bookstore, particularly one that you frequent with some regularity, and that was redundant. And it's like some occultist, metaphysician, whatever, just died and left their whole collection, or somebody's parents found their stash and just ditched all of them at the used bookstore. So instead of being like 5 or 6 Carlos Castaneda books, there'll be like dozens from like Llewellyn and Weiser and some of these other publishers that are worth actually looking at. And today was such a day. I walked in and there were like 4 full shelves of all kinds of stuff. Most of the books were from the late 90s and into like 2005 or 6, which I think of, that's like the Llewellyn heyday, certainly. It's a little bit after when I first got involved in Wicca and witchcraft, and there was just, I don't know if it's just the nostalgia or what it is, but so much good stuff came out at that period. And a lot of those books are out of print now, especially since Citadel with Kensington, they went down. So we lost a bunch of those books, and I don't know, like, it was cool just kind of getting to be nostalgic, and also just picking up some older titles that I didn't own for really cheap. But it sort of got me thinking, and I've been thinking about this lately just because I'm working on a second book project, and I'm not going to talk so much about the subject right now, but given that I'm working on another book project, I'm thinking a lot about like what it is that we write about, and what it is that people want to buy, and what it is that sells. And I was thinking about this beast of the beginner book, and kind of wondering, like, I know I've talked about this before. I don't know if I've like said it really specifically in a video, but when total noobs ask me about, like, what is Wicca? Can you recommend a book? I really don't have like beginner books that I love. I don't have like a single title that I recommend to people. I always kind of come up with this batch of books, and I try to sort of customize it based on what they're actually looking for. Like, do they just want to learn about magic? Are they interested in like becoming some kind of like kooky Alexandrian Golden Dawn person? Or like, what is it that they actually are looking for? Do they just want to like talk to Hecate or something, right? Because those are all different books that you'd recommend. But when it comes to just like Wicca 101, or even like witchcraft broadly 101, a lot of books we recommend them and we love them, but a lot of it is nostalgia, right? Like, I love Scott Cunningham's Wicca, but like, that's not my book that I recommend to people, just because like I have to start with the disclaimer about how, contrary to the first chapter, actually Wicca is not shamanism, right? Or something like there are too many disclaimers that need to be attached to some of these books now. Oh, well, Paul Hewson, Mastering Witchcraft is great, but blah, 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 blah. Like, you have to consider when books are released and who the target audience was and kind of how the culture has shifted. And there's just nothing that I love anymore. I mean, who we are as witches is the product of a period of time. Like, people aren't just reflections of one or two books that they've read. Like, my own craft has changed over, you know, however many years, and there isn't one book that you can pick up and go, ah, yes, this is the way that Thorn Mooney does Wicca. At least not until July, and then you can pick up that book. But for, like, even that, like, I'm making a joke, but there isn't, like, a one book that's kind of like, yes, this is the beginning of, this is where I should get started in Wicca or witchcraft. So I was kind of, like, brainstorming about what, like, the ideal beginner's book would look like. Not that I'm writing a beginner's book, but just kind of, like, playing around with that idea. And if you go on Amazon and you look at, like, books specifically about Wicca and witchcraft, like introductory books, like if you go and you type in witchcraft or Wicca and you look at, like, the bestsellers, the first several titles are kind of the classics from, like, the 90s. Like, Buckland's book comes up and Scott Cunningham comes up. But then you get stuff like Witch by Lisa Lister, and you get Basic Witch, whose author escapes me. You get a lot of books that, like, aren't about witchcraft in the same way that most of us here in, like, the pagan YouTube land. It's not how we're necessarily using the word witch. Like, kind of this new kind of, like, late, like, teens, like 2000s witch, you know, approaching 2020. Like, she's not a witch because she casts spells and, like, worships the god Skyclad in a magic circle. She's a witch because she's her own boss, and she's a feminist, and she's got, like, elemental tattoos on her fingers. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not denying folks like that the right to use the word witch, but I do think it's useful to point out that when I'm talking about being a witch, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking very specifically about a very particular religious practice of witchcraft, and I realize that's just me. But, like, I definitely picked up, like, the Lisa Lister book and some of these others that, like, maybe they're good and they're useful for their purpose, but their purpose isn't to teach people Wicca or to teach people even witchcraft in the way that even, like, non-Wiccan witches would understand what witchcraft is. You know what I mean? Like, it's very much an aesthetic, and that's something that's been critiqued pretty heavily in the last few years. Like, this idea of aesthetic witchcraft. I made a video myself a year or two ago about it. And it's a phenomenon that, you know, it's kind of how fashion works. So I won't say that it's confusing. Like, I think it's kind of appropriate for the times, but it's definitely not a witchcraft that I recognize as belonging in the same family as what I do. But anyway, like, a lot of the beginner books that are coming out are really about that. And when you read them, there's a lot of stuff about, like, being your own person and, like, being your own therapist, and, you know, there'll be stuff that's, like, very vaguely magical in the most, like, kind of watered down way about, like, cleansing your chakras and carrying around quartz crystals. But, you know, there's not a whole lot of, like, I don't know, there's just not a whole lot of the ritual that I've come to see as, like, cornerstone in magical practice. This idea of, like, hedge crossing or establishing relationships with spirits and the land and those kinds of things that I think, you know, both traditional witches and Wiccans, like, this is a thing that we have in common, is those kinds of magical practices. And those practices aren't necessarily what I'm seeing in a lot of the new books about witchcraft. And I think it's also noteworthy that those new books aren't coming out on occult presses. Like, it's not Weiser putting out these books. It's not Llewellyn. It's not, you know, it's certainly not, like, Three Hands or Troy or some of these other, like, niche publishers. It's large mainstream kind of big publishing houses doing it. So it's just another way that witchcraft kind of moves into this mainstream, which is old news by itself. But just playing around with increasingly people who ask me about witchcraft are coming from that kind of place, right? I mean, they're coming from this area where like witchiness has a lot to do with how you look and how you carry yourself, and not necessarily anything to do with like your worldview, or certainly not your ritual practices. And like sometimes those people cross over and they want to know more about like the actual practice of witchcraft. And I don't really know where to point them a lot of the times, but the information's all out there, right? So which is why I wonder, do we necessarily even need more beginner books? Because there's so much good stuff out there. I mean, like there's good stuff in Cunningham. There's good stuff. I think about like Diane Sylvan, The Circle Within. You know, like, geez, who the hell else? I still really like Ellen Cannon Reed's Heart of Wicca. So like there are lots of good books out there to recommend, but you kind of have to read all of them and take them piecemeal. There's no one book. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily aspire to a book, but I kind of wonder, like, I don't know, what would Scott Cunningham writing about Wicca in 2018 look like? You know, like, what would that be? What would that book be? I'd like to think that it would be more theologically challenging and more like inclusive, and you know, there's so many things. But anyway, it's been kind of just an interesting mental exercise. So anyway, I'm rambling, and I need to stop procrastinating and get back to writing this thing that I'm writing. But I'm curious, like, what are the beginner books that you point people to, or like what would you look for in beginner books? Because I still buy books when they come out, like, even though, you know, I've read a whole bunch, and at some point they all kind of feel like the same book, but I still read them. And you know, like, what would we look for in a brand new Witchcraft 101 book in 2018 that hadn't already been said? Anyway, have a good night.